Hello, Minister.
Hey, good morning, Mark. How are you?
I'm great. How are you?
I'm fine, thanks. I'm sorry I'm not with you in Toronto. I would have much preferred, obviously, to be in the room with you. I went to University of Toronto some decades ago. I've got friends there. I'm always looking for a good reason to go to Toronto, and yours is about the best I could get. But it's National Caucus Day, and I've got to go to Montreal for something this evening. So I apologize I'm not there with you, but I appreciate the invitation.
We appreciate your time. So I think the big focus of the conversation today, Minister, is going to be about Canada-U.S. trade and what to kind of expect over the coming months. So we are now about 2.5 months out from July 1st. That's the date at which you and your counterparts in Mexico and the United States have to sit down and figure something out about the CUSMA or USMCA. So I'm wondering, to kind of kick things off, what do you expect to actually happen on that July 1st date?
Mark, we were hoping, and we still have some hope, that by July 1st, the three countries would agree to extend the CUSMA free trade agreement for another 16 years. That's what's contemplated in the treaty. As you know, it said on the 6th anniversary of coming into effect, which is this date in a couple of months, 2.5 months from now, there has to be a review. It's not a renegotiation, it's a review. It's rather vague as to what the review is. We were preparing, as are the Americans and as are the Mexicans, for a conversation about things that we may want to adjust, we may want to improve. Obviously, overlaying all of that are these sectoral tariffs, Section 232 tariffs, which obviously aren't aren't in accordance with CUSMA, but they've applied across the board to all of their trading partners. So what will practically happen on July 1st, Mark, is if there is no consensus or agreement amongst the three parties to the trilateral agreement, we fall into a 10-year period where the treaty remains in effect until 2036, and there are annual reviews that theoretically occur after that date. Ambassador Greer said publicly, U.S. Trade Representative Jameson Greer, what he's been saying to us privately and to the Mexicans, if there's no agreement by July 1st, and he said candidly, publicly, or well, maybe that's a contradiction he said publicly what he said to us privately, that if he doesn't think that perhaps he can get all the work done with Mexico and Canada that he wants by July 1st, then we'll fall into this 10-year period where the treaty remains in effect. There'll be annual reviews. But what's interesting is if the three countries agreed on September 1st, October 10th, November 15th, I'm just making up dates, if we agreed July 1st is the date prescribed in the treaty, but there's nothing stopping the three countries from agreeing at some subsequent date to extend the agreement another 16 years. So bottom line is not much will change on July 1, other than it's part of what we think is increasingly worrisome uncertainty that this constant sort of turbulence, largely generated in the United States, has around business and investor decisions in our country. So that remains obviously a high concern for our government.
So if we are past July 1st and we're into this annual review period, what do you expect are kind of forcing mechanisms or reasons to continue negotiations to kind of, keep things going? I mean, as you say, we could be past July 1. Are we not talking till the next July 1st? What do you kind of expect to see, let's say, over the summer months and into the fall?
Sure. So I would hope, Mark, that obviously is not the case. I think it's important to state to your audience gathered in Toronto, senior business people from across the country, we are absolutely ready to sit down and come to an agreement quickly. We have done a lot of consultative work on doing some more again this week. We, as you saw yesterday, reestablished an advisory group. I think that'll be very helpful. But the Prime Minister has given us, Janice Charette and me, Ambassador Wiseman, pretty clear instructions We have very regular meetings with him, with Michael Sabia, the clerk of the Privy Council, Marc-André Blanchard. There's a group of us that remain actively seized of this work. So we're ready when the Americans are ready to sit down and get that agreement. And as I say, our hope is that it happens before July 1st. If it doesn't, we're ready to work this summer, and we're ready to do what's necessary to get to a tripartite agreement. We talked to the Mexicans a lot as well. Secretary Ebrard, the economy secretary, is bringing a big delegation of Mexican business people. In fact, he'll be in Toronto and Montreal first week of May. He and I speak often. They're exactly of the same view as we are, that we need to recommit to a trilateral agreement. I think, Mark, what we're also going to see is if we get to a recommitment to the trilateral agreement, there will be bilateral arrangements between countries sort of adjacent to or beside the main framework CUSMA agreement. Secretary Lutnick, Ambassador Greer have said this publicly as well, that there is I think Ambassador Greer said CUSMA, or USMCA as they call it, constitutes load-bearing walls for the U.S. economy. I think that gives us some indication that they want to preserve the framework of the trilateral agreement, as do we, as do the Mexicans. We need to get relief on the sectoral tariffs. The Americans also talked to us, Mark, about things that they would like to do with Canada around energy security. They call it energy dominance. There are opportunities to be an even increased supplier to the United States of their energy needs. There are things that we can do in critical minerals. So there's a whole series of, obviously there are defense, procurement and defense issues. The Prime Minister talks to the President about these issues all the time. We think at one point there's an ability to put together a package that will very much be in the economic interest of both countries, Canada and the United States, and that might clear the deck of some of these bilateral issues that the Americans are raising with us, or the longer list that they're working through with the Mexicans.
You mentioned the Mexicans. I mean, they, over the past, let's say, month and a half, have engaged pretty extensively with the U.S. I mean, it's longer than that, over the past year or so. But they are now in technical discussions. It's not just about bilateral issues. They're talking about core issues like rules of origin. Jameson Greer was in Mexico City this week meeting with President Sheinbaum. We do not seem to be engaging with that level of detail at this point in time. What's going on? Why aren't we at the table with them, especially because, again, it's not just bilateral things. They are talking about core issues. What's going on here with the U.S. and Mexico, and why aren't we in the room?
So the American preference was to begin these conversations bilaterally. They've fully said to us that, of course, things like, and you mentioned rules of origin, are things that would properly be part of the trilateral agreement. They say to us that they expect us to have those conversations as well, and ultimately at a trilateral, in a trilateral context. Our preference would have been to, as you said, have those conversations up front trilaterally. I think, to be fair, there are, and I heard this from our Mexican counterparts. I was in Mexico City about a month and a half ago with a large Canadian business delegation. We met with President Sheinbaum, and I spent a lot of time with senior ministers in the Mexican government, mainly Secretary Ebrard, the foreign secretary at the time. They have a much different list than Canada does from the United States about things they want to resolve bilaterally. The Americans decided to start on that with the Mexicans. As you say, they have decided to talk about rules of origin. But take rules of origin, for example, in the steel industry. The Americans say to us, I believe it's true, we've done work with some of the Canadian steel companies. Canada has amongst the best in class rules around transshipment, around melt and pour, smelt and cast in the case of aluminum. The Americans acknowledge to us that what we're doing in steel, in terms of ensuring non-market economies aren't dumping into North America is best in class. So maybe they're having different conversations with other partners, but they were going to start somewhere, Mark. They know that we are ready to have those conversations, but I think it's also important to state the obvious, and the Prime Minister sort of has said this publicly in the last number of weeks. We're not going to make a series of concessions or agree to a series of things that aren't in the interests of the Canadian economy, Canadian businesses, Canadian workers, just to get to a table and have a statement appear on a website in the United States to then receive a whole second list of things that they're going to want. So our list is much shorter than the Mexicans. We have solutions to most of what the Americans raised, and we're happy to sit down and go through that with them, but it's got to be part of a larger, more comprehensive arrangement. We're not prepared to sit down, on the list of things that they want Canada to deal with is the digital services tax. Well, good news. In the budget legislation, not only was it abolished, the money was reimbursed with interest to American companies, some of whom had already charged that to their customers, their clients. So check the box, that's done. They wanted the retaliatory tariffs lifted. That was also done. So at one point, there's an obligation for all of us to sit down. We think recommit quickly to a trilateral arrangement, which is in the economic interest of all three countries. But, you know, we're not going to have the salami sliced all the time and find ourselves in a position where the deal that's offered is not in Canada's interest. The Prime Minister has been very firm, and properly so, that we want a comprehensive arrangement that deals with the sectoral tariffs, that commits to a process, ideally a renewal of the trilateral arrangement. And we believe that all of that's possible. So there's a public discussion in the United States. There are private conversations at multiple levels with senior American officials. We are not pessimistic that that doesn't remain a very viable outcome.
You mentioned the sectoral tariffs, so that is the tariffs on steel, aluminum, automobiles, lumber products. Earlier this week, there were reports that Jameson Greer told his Mexican counterparts that some level of tariffs are going to remain in place. The 232 tariffs, which are these sectoral tariffs, are not going away. Janice Charette, speaking yesterday, essentially confirmed that she expected these tariffs to, at some level, remain in place. What is your expectation? What have the Americans told you about the 232 tariffs? Is there any wiggle room to budge, to adjust the levels, to come up with tariff rate quotas? Like, what do you understand their goals are with the 232s and where they might be able to budge on?
So, Mark, critical question, and you're right. We've seen what Jameson said, I think, in Mexico or as part of his visit to Mexico. It's not inconsistent with what they say to us privately. The Section 232 tariffs are properly under the authority of the Commerce Department. It's Secretary Lutnick who receives the direction in the executive orders around 232 tariffs. So Jameson is not wrong when he says, I'm handling the CUSMA review process. The 232s are somewhere else. It's in the Commerce Department. That is true, and those tariffs apply across the board around the world. Canada and Mexico, however, are in, and these are conversations we have with the Mexicans often, we're in a different category if you look at, and you mentioned the sectors, the integration in the supply chains, in production, in steel, aluminum, automobiles. The Americans are buying softwood lumber from Canada, Mark, not because they want to be nice to us. It's because their own market prices higher eastern white pine or softwood lumber from the Canadian, from British Columbia or the Canadian West, Western region, because it's a different fiber and high-end home builders are looking for these products. So we think, and to go back to something that's obvious too, they say that the sectoral tariffs to some extent will remain in place. I think we should be realistic. They have not taken anybody to zero, made a deal that takes those tariffs to zero. But you, I think in the question, Mark, talked about, is there a level or an adjustment? Sure there is. a sectoral tariff at 50% on Canadian steel is much different than something that's considerably lower than that. The good news is in October, we were very close in terms of having a deal that would have significantly lowered these sectoral tariffs. You're right, in some cases there may have been a TRQ. Some cases there wasn't. The details of that, I just want to be a bit careful, but I think this is public, that the draft arrangement, and we were exchanging term sheets with the United States. So, and this wouldn't have been a surprise to the White House or the president. So they have in the past shown some willingness to talk about that. They decided to interrupt those conversations. We say to them, we're absolutely ready to resume the discussion where we were in October. And if you look at global circumstances around energy security, you look at what's happening in the Middle East and the price of gas in the United States and Canada's potential to be an increased energy partner with the Americans. I'm convinced in all of those different moving parts, Mark, there is an opportunity to come to a deal with the United States that will, we hope, significantly reduce the difficult headwind that those sectoral tariffs represent. And at the same time, the trilateral agreement is on its own merit something that's in their economic interest as well.
In terms of the, am I still on? Hey, there we go. Lost me for a second. In terms of the specific bilateral grievances, I mean, there is a list that the USTR publishes which says all the things it doesn't like about its trade partners' activities. You can all go look it up. The list includes a number of items a lot of us would be familiar with. They don't like dairy quota allocation, how we manage supply management. They're grumpy about liquor being taken off shelves, buy Canadian policy, attempts at sovereign data. The list is fairly long. And I should say as well, Jameson Greer has said explicitly, we will not renew the deal unless we get Canada to budge on a number of these issues. So the ask is pretty explicit. What on those lists and on the kind of top line items, supply management, online streaming, what are we willing to budge on and what are the red lines that we are not going to budge on?
I could see you're a senior journalist at an important economic conference asking, in French, it's la question qui tue. You've asked exactly, Mark, the right question. You'll get, it sounds like a greasy political answer, but it happens to be the truthful one. We're not going to discuss publicly the details of those conversations, but to frame an answer to what is a perfectly, and I'm sort of teasing you a bit, I can't see you smiling. You look very serious at that podium. Oh, there you go.
I'm smiling.
So there you go. So Mark, you're right. A lot of this is in the public space. They publish an annual national trade estimates. This is the U.S. Trade Representative's Office. It is the list of all the grievances. It's an annual list. They talk to us in private about a much smaller subset of that. They put on a whole series of things. So for example, the French language requirements in Quebec constitute a non-tariff or non-trade barrier. Well, we've been very clear with them. We're not going to limit, reduce, negotiate those language requirements. The cultural exemption. We're not going to reopen supply management and have a discussion around quotas in the supply managed sector. In fact, Parliament unanimously passed legislation in that regard. They know that. In the private conversations, they recognize that you use the word red lines. They recognize that there are certain things that Canada, and it's true of Mexico as well, and it's true of the United States, by the way, that we're not prepared to reopen or negotiate. This is a review. So they can't, no country is going to go through the CUSMA agreement and say, you know what, at the bargaining table 6 years ago, we didn't successfully get everything we wanted in this area, so now you have to give us everything we want, or somehow the agreement's not going to work. That's not the way the conversation goes. The encouraging thing is this, Mark. In the list, the subset of their big public list that they talk to us about, And you're right, some of these issues are provincial, entirely within provincial jurisdiction. Provincial procurement policies. Alcohol back on the shelves in some provinces, and they look at the big ones. We have said to them, you know what, if you want the Premier of Ontario or the Premier of Quebec or the Premier of British Columbia to change those policies, you have to give them some relief or some path to a better outcome on softwood lumber in the case of British Columbia, on steel and automobiles in the case of Ontario, aluminum and softwood lumber in Quebec. So pick your myriad of these combinations. We've said to them very firmly, the government of Canada is not going to ask the provinces to do this unless you put them in a better position economically than they're in now. So on the list of things, some of the digital services tax is there. Removing some retaliatory tariffs, largely done. So we're confident that in the discussions we have with them, we can make progress on a number of these issues. Some obviously are more difficult than others, and some we're not prepared to move on. And again, in private, Mark, the good thing is they say, okay, you know what, I think that's reasonable, or I understand, I see what you mean. Okay, maybe we can consider this particular aspect resolved. So I'm not pessimistic that we can't make progress on their list. We will also talk to them about things that we want out of the review, and obviously the most important one remains those sectoral tariffs. Back to one of the original questions you asked.
I'm suddenly looking at the clock, and it seems like I have less than a minute left, but I'm going to squeeze this in because I'm very curious about the answer. The conversations aren't just bilateral issues, they're structural issues as well. A lot of those conversations are going to happen around rules of origin, which for the audience is how much of a content of a vehicle or another kind of manufactured item needs to come within North America to trade tariff-free. The US has said a core goal for them is increasing, basically tightening these rules of origin. What is Canada's position on tighter rules of origin, both in autos and in a broader range of industrial goods?
So again, we have been very open with the Americans, and I think the Mexicans, I don't want to speak for the Mexican government, of course, but I think they're not in a different position. We're absolutely prepared to have those conversations. The Americans are focused particularly on the non-market economy countries that they say, and not without reason, are dumping certain commodity products into the North American market. They worry about transshipment, as do we. They say to us, and we absolutely know it to be true, we have some of the most rigorous rules, particularly we talked about steel and aluminum as a good example, to avoid transshipment, to require the melt and pour, smelt and cast rules, traceability. But we've said if they want to have a discussion trilaterally about how we can strengthen North America's competitiveness against that particular economic threat, we're all in and happy to have those conversations. All three jurisdictions have different measures in place, but have a common objective. So if the U.S. wants us to work together on those kind of issues, they certainly won't see any resistance from us.
Great. We're going to have to leave it there. Thank you so much. That was a lot of great insight into how things are progressing and expectations for the coming months. So if the audience can join me in giving a big round of applause for Minister LeBlanc.
Mark, thank you very much for inviting me. It's a privilege to be there, and I hope next time it can be in person. But I appreciate this opportunity, and thanks to your audience for all of the work that you're doing for Canada. We certainly appreciate it. Merci beaucoup.